She'd been turned down by 12 different ranchers across Montana, each one saying the same cruel words: "A woman who can't bear children ain't worth the trouble." But when a grizzled cattle rancher with 6 wild kids rode into her life, he looked her dead in the eye and said something that changed everything. Could a woman considered broken by everyone else become the very salvation a struggling family desperately needed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind cut through Helena, Montana like a blade in 1887, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and distant cattle. Margaret Holloway stood in Dr. Samuel Bennett's office, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of his oak desk. The words he'd just spoken hung in the air between them like a death sentence. "I'm truly sorry, Miss Holloway. The scarring from the fever you had as a child, it's made it impossible for you to conceive. You'll never bear children." Margaret's world tilted. At 26, she'd spent the last 8 years working as a seamstress in Helena, saving every penny, dreaming of the day she'd have a family of her own. She'd survived the loss of both parents to consumption, built a modest life from nothing, and believed that someday, somehow, love would find her. Now that dream lay shattered at her feet. She walked out of that office into the golden light of late afternoon, but saw none of its beauty. The streets of Helena bustled with miners, merchants, and cattlemen, but their voices seemed distant, underwater. Margaret made her way to the small room she rented above the general store, climbed the narrow stairs, and sat by the window overlooking Main Street. For 3 days, she barely moved. The realization settled over her like winter snow, heavy, cold, suffocating. In this territory, a woman's worth was measured in many ways, but none more important than her ability to bear children. Ranches needed heirs. Families needed continuity. The harsh Montana landscape demanded strength in numbers. What use was a woman who couldn't provide that? On the 4th day, Margaret's landlady, Mrs. Catherine Walsh, knocked on her door. The elderly woman took one look at Margaret's hollow eyes and knew something terrible had happened. "Child, whatever burden you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone," Mrs. Walsh said, settling into the worn chair across from Margaret. The whole story came pouring out. When Margaret finished, she expected pity. Instead, Mrs. Walsh's weathered face hardened with determination. "Listen to me, Margaret Holloway. I've lived 63 years in this territory, and I've learned one thing. A person's worth isn't determined by what they can or can't do. It's determined by who they are." She leaned forward, her grey eyes fierce. "You're one of the finest seamstresses in the 3 counties. You've built a business from nothing. You've got a heart bigger than the Montana sky. Any man who can't see that isn't worth your time." Margaret wanted to believe her. God, how she wanted to believe her. But the world had other ideas. 3 months later, Thomas Crawford came calling. He owned a medium-sized ranch 15 miles outside Helena and needed a wife. He was practical, efficient, and had made his intentions clear from the start. He wanted children to help work the land. Margaret had agonized for 2 weeks before telling him the truth. They'd been sitting in Mrs. Walsh's parlor, and she'd forced herself to meet his eyes as she explained her condition. Thomas had stood up immediately, his face flushing red. "You let me waste 3 weeks courting you, knowing full well you couldn't give me what I need." He'd grabbed his hat and stormed toward the door, then paused. "A barren woman's got no business deceiving honest men, Miss Holloway. That's just cruel." The door had slammed so hard the windows rattled. That was only the first. Over the next year and a half, Margaret tried to build something with 11 other men. Each time she was honest from the beginning, hoping that perhaps her other qualities might be enough. Each time she was wrong. Daniel Foster, a young homesteader, had seemed kind until she told him. "I need sons to work this land, not a wife who's only half a woman," he'd said, his kindness evaporating like morning dew. Robert Mitchell had been more diplomatic. "I'm sure you understand, Miss Holloway. A man in my position needs to think practically about the future. James Peterson hadn't even let her finish explaining before he'd stood up and walked away without a word. The rejections blurred together, each one a fresh wound. Some men were cruel, some were simply matter-of-fact. But the result was always the same. She wasn't enough. By the spring of 1889, Margaret had stopped trying. She threw herself into her work, her fingers flying across fabric, creating beautiful dresses for other women's weddings, christening gowns for other women's babies. She'd built a wall around her heart, brick by painful brick, and convinced herself she was content. The town, of course, noticed. Helena wasn't large enough for secrets. Women whispered in the mercantile. Men shook their heads in saloons. Margaret Holloway became a cautionary tale, a reminder of fortune's cruelty. Such a shame, they'd say. Pretty enough, skilled with a needle, but what good is any of that? Mrs. Walsh remained her staunchest defender, but even her fierce loyalty couldn't change facts. Margaret was 28 now, well past the age most women married in the territory. Combined with her inability to have children, she knew her chances of finding love had passed her by. She'd made peace with it. Or so she told herself. What Margaret didn't know, couldn't know, was that 60 miles north in the small town of Boulder, a man named Jacob Morrison was praying for a miracle. His wife had died 8 months earlier, leaving him alone with 6 children, ranging from 3 to 14. His ranch was failing, his kids were running wild, and he was drowning in grief and responsibility. He'd prayed every night for an answer, for someone who could help him save his family. He had no idea that his answer was a woman the world had deemed broken, or that their meeting would prove everyone spectacularly wrong about what truly makes a person whole. Jacob Morrison had once been a man who laughed easily. His neighbors in Boulder remembered him as someone whose joy was infectious, whose love for his wife Sarah had been the kind poets wrote about. They'd built their ranch together from nothing, 2 young dreamers who'd come west in 1875 with little more than hope and determination. Now, in the summer of 1889, Jacob was a shell of that man. Sarah had died giving birth to their 6th child, little Emma. The baby had survived, but Jacob had lost the woman who'd been his entire world. For 8 months, he'd been stumbling through each day like a man walking through thick fog, unable to see more than a few feet ahead. The ranch was suffering. Fences needed mending. The barn roof leaked. His cattle were scattered across the hills, half wild from neglect. But worse than any of that, far worse, was watching his children fall apart. 14-year-old Samuel had become angry, picking fights with his younger siblings, disappearing for hours to avoid the chaos at home. 12-year-old Rebecca had taken on far too much responsibility, trying to mother her younger siblings while her own childhood slipped away. 10-year-old Lucas had grown quiet, his once bright chatter replaced by a silence that worried Jacob deeply. 7-year-old William wet the bed most nights, crying for his mama. 5-year-old Charlotte clung to Rebecca's skirts, terrified to let her sister out of sight, and baby Emma, now 8 months old, needed constant care that Jacob struggled to provide while managing everything else. His mother-in-law, Josephine Carter, had come to help immediately after Sarah's death. But Josephine was 67 and frail, her own health declining. 3 weeks ago, she'd sat Jacob down with tears streaming down her weathered face. "Jacob, I love these children more than my own life, but I can't do this anymore. My heart's giving out. Dr. Patterson says I've got maybe a year, possibly less. I need to go stay with my sister in Oregon while I still can." She gripped his hands. "You need to find help, real help. These babies need more than an old woman who can barely climb stairs." Jacob had nodded, understanding but terrified. Josephine left on the morning stage 4 days later, and suddenly Jacob was truly alone. He'd tried hiring help. Martha Stevens, a widow from town, lasted 3 days before Emma's constant crying and the boys' roughhousing drove her away. Young Annie Porter seemed promising until William accidentally set her apron on fire while she was cooking, and she'd fled the ranch screaming that these children were unmanageable devils. The church ladies of Boulder had organized a rotation. each taking turns bringing meals and helping with the children. But it was temporary, unsustainable. They had their own families, their own responsibilities. Jacob could see the strain in their eyes, hear the relief in their voices when their shift ended. On a particularly brutal Tuesday, everything came to a head. Jacob had been out since dawn, trying to round up strays, leaving Rebecca in charge. When he returned at sunset, he found absolute chaos. Charlotte was sobbing because she'd fallen and scraped her knee. William and Lucas were covered in mud from head to toe after fighting near the pig pen. Samuel had a black eye from a fight in town. Emma was screaming, hungry and wet. Rebecca sat in the middle of it all, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this anymore, Papa," she'd cried. "I'm trying so hard, but I'm just a kid. I don't know how to do all this." Jacob had pulled her into his arms, feeling her thin shoulders shake with sobs, and something inside him broke completely. His 12-year-old daughter shouldn't be carrying the weight of a household. None of his children should be living like this. That night, after finally getting all the children to bed, Jacob sank to his knees in his empty bedroom. He wasn't a man who prayed often. Sarah had been the faithful one, but desperation drove him to it now. "God, I don't know if you're listening. I don't know if I deserve your help after how I've let everything fall apart. But these children, they deserve better. They deserve someone who can give them what I can't." His voice cracked. "I need help. I need a miracle. Send me someone who can save this family, because I sure as hell can't do it alone anymore." He stayed there on the cold floor until his knees ached, then climbed into the bed he'd once shared with Sarah and stared at the ceiling until dawn. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning, Pastor William Hutchins stopped by the ranch. The older man had been a steady presence since Sarah's death, checking in regularly, offering what comfort he could. "Jacob, I've been thinking," Pastor Hutchins said, as they sat on the porch while the children ate breakfast inside. "You need a wife, not just for help with the children, though God knows you need that, but for you, for them. This family needs wholeness again." Jacob shook his head. "Who'd want to take on this mess? 6 kids, a failing ranch, and a man who can barely keep his head above water. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. You might be surprised," the pastor said gently. "There are good women out there who understand that love isn't always pretty, that family isn't always convenient." He pulled out a worn journal. "I correspond with pastors across the territory. Let me make some inquiries. See if there's someone out there who might be right for you and your children." Jacob wanted to say no. The idea of replacing Sarah felt like betrayal. But when Emma started crying inside, and he heard Rebecca's exhausted voice trying to soothe her, he knew he had no choice. "All right," he whispered, "but I need someone who understands what they're getting into. I won't lie to anyone about how hard this is." Over the next 3 weeks, Pastor Hutchins received responses from his network of clergy across Montana. Several women were suggested, but each one fell through. One backed out when she learned about the 6 children. Another wanted assurances about the ranch's financial stability that Jacob couldn't provide. A third seemed perfect until she visited and spent exactly 2 hours with the children before, declaring them undisciplined wild animals and taking the next stage out of. Boulder Jacob's hope was dying again. Maybe this was his lot, to struggle alone, to watch his children suffer, to fail them all. Then, on a scorching July afternoon, Pastor Hutchins arrived with a letter. His expression was thoughtful, almost curious. "This one's different, Jacob," he said, handing over the envelope. Pastor Richard Coleman in Helena wrote about a woman in his congregation. Margaret Holloway, 28 seamstress, lost both parents young, built a successful business on her own. He says she's kind, patient, and has a good heart. Jacob felt a flicker of something, not quite hope, but close. "Why hasn't she married?" Pastor Hutchins hesitated. "She can't have children. Some illness when she was young. She's been rejected by quite a few men because of it. Pastor Coleman says she's given up on finding a husband, but he thinks she might be exactly what your family needs." Jacob's first instinct was disappointment. More children had been part of his dreams with Sarah. They talked about having 8 or 9, filling the ranch with life and laughter. But then he looked through the window at his 6 existing children, at Rebecca trying to feed Emma while simultaneously helping Charlotte with her hair. And reality settled over him. "I don't need more children," he said slowly. "I need someone who can love the ones I already have." That night, Jacob did something he hadn't done since Sarah died. He sat down and wrote a letter with genuine hope. His handwriting was rough, unpracticed, but the words came from somewhere deep. "Dear Miss Holloway, Pastor Hutchins tells me you're a woman who's known rejection and hardship. Well, I'm a man drowning in both, with 6 children who need more than I can give them alone. I won't lie to you, this would be hard. My kids are hurting and acting out. My ranch is struggling. I'm barely holding things together, but here's what I can offer: honesty, hard work. A man who'll appreciate you for who you are, not what you can or can't do. And 6 children who desperately need someone to care about them. I don't know if this interests you at all. I don't even know if I should be writing this letter. But something tells me that maybe, just maybe, what the world sees as broken in both of us might actually fit together just right. If you're willing to at least meet, I'd be grateful. If not, I understand and wish you well. Respectfully, Jacob Morrison." He sealed the letter before he could second-guess himself and handed it to Pastor Hutchins the next morning. "I hope you know what you're doing," the pastor said with a small smile. Jacob didn't, but for the first time in 8 months, he felt like he was at least doing something. The letter made its way south to Helena, carried by stagecoach across 60 miles of Montana territory. It arrived on a Wednesday afternoon and was delivered to the small room above the general store, where Margaret Holloway sat sewing a wedding dress for someone else's happy ending. When she saw the letter, saw the rough handwriting and the bolder postmark, she almost threw it away. Another well-meaning attempt to pair her with someone who'd eventually realize she wasn't enough. But something made her open it, and as she read Jacob Morrison's words, something inside her chest, something she'd thought dead and buried, began to stir back to life. Margaret read Jacob Morrison's letter 3 times that first night, each reading revealing something new. The handwriting was uneven, the words simple, but there was something raw and genuine in every sentence that made her chest tighten. What the world sees as broken in both of us might actually fit together just right. She traced those words with her finger, feeling tears prick her eyes. In all her rejections, not one man had ever suggested that her inability to bear children might not be a flaw. Not one had ever implied that maybe, just maybe, she was exactly what someone needed. Not in spite of her condition, but because of who she was as a complete person. Mrs. Walsh found her at dawn, still sitting by the window with the letter clutched in her hands. "You haven't slept," the older woman observed, settling into her usual chair. "Catherine, what if this is real?" Margaret whispered. "What if there's actually someone out there who sees me as enough?" "Only one way to find out, child." Margaret spent the entire day in turmoil. She tried to work on her sewing, but kept pricking her fingers, distracted. Every logical part of her brain screamed warnings. 6 children, a struggling ranch, a grieving widower. This wasn't some romantic fairy tale. This was jumping into the deep end of a river, not knowing if she could swim, but another part of her, the part that had been silent for so long, whispered something different. What if this is your chance? What if all those rejections led you here, to this moment, to this man who needs exactly who you are? That evening, she pulled out her writing paper. Her hand trembled as she began. "Dear Mr. Morrison, your letter reached me at a time when I'd convinced myself that hope was a luxury I could no longer afford. I won't pretend I'm not frightened by what you're proposing. 6 children is no small responsibility, and I've never been a mother. But something in your words struck me deeply. You speak of honesty, so let me be honest too. I've been rejected 12 times because men saw me as incomplete, defective, not worth the trouble. You're the first person who's ever suggested that maybe what I am is exactly what's needed. I'm a hard worker. I'm patient. Years of needlework taught me that. I know how to stretch $1 and make something beautiful from scraps. But I don't know if that's enough for what you need. Still, I'm willing to meet you, to see if perhaps this unlikely possibility could become something real. If you're still interested after knowing more about me, I can take the stage to Boulder next Saturday. With cautious hope, Margaret Holloway, she sealed the letter before doubt could stop her and posted it the next morning. The reply came faster than expected. Jacob's second letter was even more revealing than his first. Dear Margaret, next Saturday works perfectly. I'll meet your stage at noon. Fair warning, I'm bringing my 2 oldest children with me. Rebecca is 12 and Samuel is 14. If you're going to be part of this family, they should have a say. Also, Rebecca's been trying to hold everything together for months. He deserves to meet you first. You mentioned being rejected 12 times. That tells me you kept trying, kept hoping, even when the world told you to give up. That's exactly the kind of strength my children need to see. Not perfection, strength. One more thing. You said you don't know if you're enough. Margaret, I have 6 kids who are hurting, a ranch that's falling apart, and I'm barely keeping my head above water. Enough is a pretty flexible concept around here. We don't need perfect. We need real. See you Saturday, Jacob. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright. Margaret packed a small bag, her hands surprisingly steady. Mrs. Walsh helped her into her best dress, a deep blue calico that brought out her eyes, and pinned her dark hair into a neat bun. You look beautiful, child, Mrs. Walsh said, her eyes misty. And whatever happens today, remember, you're walking toward possibility, not away from it. The stagecoach ride to Boulder took nearly 3 hours over rough terrain. Margaret spent the entire journey alternating between excitement and terror. What if she disappointed them? What if the children hated her? What if she took one look at the situation and realized she'd made a terrible mistake? The stage rolled into Boulder just before noon, dust swirling around the wheels as it came to a stop in front of the general store. Margaret peered through the window, her heart hammering. A tall man stood waiting, hat in hand. Even from a distance, she could see the weariness in his posture, the weight he carried. Beside him stood a girl with long brown braids and an expression far too serious for 12, and a teenage boy with his father's build and guarded eyes. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. Margaret stepped down from the stage, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. Jacob Morrison moved forward, and she got her first clear look at him. He was probably 35, with dark hair graying at the temples and lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. But there was something kind in his face, something honest that made her breathing ease slightly. Miss Holloway. His voice was deep, gentle. Mr. Morrison. She managed a small smile. Please call me Margaret. Jacob. He gestured to the children. This is Rebecca and Samuel. Rebecca stepped forward, studying Margaret with an intensity that was almost unnerving. Papa says you might come live with us. That's right, Margaret said, kneeling down to meet the girl's eyes. But only if that's something everyone wants. This is your home, your family. Your opinion matters most of all. Something flickered in Rebecca's expression. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of trust. Can you cook? The church ladies try, but most of them can't season anything right, and Annie Porter nearly burned down the kitchen. Margaret couldn't help but smile. I can cook and sew, and I'm very good at not setting kitchens on fire. Samuel snorted, almost a laugh, then caught himself and looked away. But Margaret had seen the brief crack in his armor. There's a restaurant down the street, Jacob said. Thought we could talk over lunch. All 4 of us. The restaurant was small but clean, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh bread. They settled into a corner booth, and Margaret found herself sitting across from 3 pairs of eyes, watching her every move. Rebecca got straight to the point. Why do you want to do this? Papa says you have your own business in Helena. Why would you give that up to take care of a bunch of kids who aren't even yours? Margaret appreciated the directness. She thought carefully before answering. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure yet. But your father's letter said something that stuck with me. He said maybe what seems broken in both of us might fit together. I've spent 2 years being told I'm not enough because I can't have children. But you already have children who need someone. Maybe that's how things are supposed to work sometimes. Mama died having Emma, Samuel said suddenly, his voice tight. If you can't have babies, at least you won't die like that. The pain in his words was palpable. Margaret's heart ached for this boy, trying so hard to be tough while clearly terrified of losing anyone else. I'm so sorry about your mother, she said softly. I lost both my parents when I was young. I know it's not the same, but I understand how it feels when the world suddenly doesn't make sense anymore. Samuel's jaw worked, emotions flickering across his face. Then he looked at his father. I like her better than the others. Jacob's shoulders relaxed slightly, the first hint that he'd been as nervous as Margaret. Lunch became easier after that. Rebecca peppered Margaret with questions about everything from her cooking skills to whether she knew how to handle a rifle. Samuel remained mostly quiet, but watched everything with sharp attention. Jacob interjected occasionally, adding details about the ranch, the other children, the reality of what life would be like. I won't sugarcoat it, Jacob said as they finished eating. The ranch is in rough shape. Money's tight. The younger kids are struggling with their grief in different ways. Charlotte has nightmares. William's scared of everything. Lucas barely talks anymore. And Emma's a baby who needs constant attention. You're really selling this, Margaret said dryly, surprising herself. She saw Jacob's lips twitch with amusement. Just want you to know what you'd be getting into. This isn't some romantic notion. It's hard work and heartache and chaos most days. Margaret leaned forward. Jacob, I've spent 2 years having men look at me like I'm defective merchandise. I've built a business from nothing after losing everyone I loved. I know hard work. What I don't know is if I can be what your family needs. But I'm willing to try if you'll let me. Rebecca suddenly spoke up. We should go to the ranch. Let her meet the others, see the place. Then she can decide. Jacob looked at Margaret. That all right with you? It's about a 40-minute ride. Margaret's heart raced, but she nodded. Let's do it. They borrowed a wagon from the livery, and Margaret found herself sitting next to Jacob on the bench seat, while Rebecca and Samuel climbed in back. As they left Boulder behind, the Montana landscape opened up before them. Rolling hills, distant mountains, vast sky. It's beautiful, Margaret murmured. Sarah always said that, Jacob replied quietly. Even when things were hard, she'd look at these hills and say we were blessed. He paused. I want to be clear about something, Margaret. I loved my wife. Part of me always will. I'm not looking to replace her. I wouldn't want to, Margaret said honestly. I'm not her, and I never could be. But maybe that's okay. Maybe this family needs something different now. Jacob glanced at her, something like relief in his eyes. Yeah, maybe it does. The ranch came into view, a sprawling property with a weathered house, a barn that had seen better days, and fences in desperate need of repair. But Margaret could see the potential underneath the neglect, the bones of something that could be beautiful again with care and work. As they pulled up to the house, the front door burst open. 4 children spilled out onto the porch, ranging from a tiny girl to a boy of about 10. Behind them, an elderly woman from town. Margaret recognized her as one of the church rotation helpers, looked relieved to see Jacob return. Papa! A little girl with blonde curls launched herself at Jacob the moment he climbed down. William broke Mama's vase, and Lucas won't come out of the barn, and Emma won't stop crying. Jacob caught her, exhaustion and love mixed in his expression. It's all right, Charlotte. We'll handle it. He looked at Margaret almost apologetically. Welcome to the Morrison Ranch. Margaret climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady. 5 children now stared at her, with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to outright hostility. From inside the house, a baby's wail pierced the air. This was it, the moment of truth. She could make an excuse, take the next stage back to Helena, return to her quiet, safe, lonely life, or she could step forward into the beautiful, terrifying unknown. Margaret took a deep breath, smoothed her skirts and walked toward the porch. Well then, she said, looking at each child in turn, I'm Margaret, and it sounds like we have a broken vase to deal with and a baby to calm down. Who wants to show me where everything is? Little Charlotte slipped her hand into Margaret's without hesitation. I can show you. But you should know, Emma's really loud when she's mad. Then we'd better go meet Emma, Margaret said, squeezing the small hand in hers as she stepped across the threshold of the Morrison house into the chaos and noise and need. Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like she was home. The inside of the Morrison house told the story of a family barely surviving. Dishes were piled in the wash basin. Laundry overflowed from baskets. Toys and tools lay scattered across every surface. The curtains hung crooked and dust coated the windowsills. But beneath the chaos, Margaret could see traces of what this home had once been. Careful stitching on throw pillows, a beautifully carved mantelpiece, photographs arranged with love on the walls, a woman's touch, now absent. Emma's screaming grew louder as they approached the nursery. Charlotte tugged Margaret's hand urgently. She's been crying for an hour. Mrs. Henderson tried everything, but Emma don't like her much. Mrs. Henderson, a stout woman in her 50s, emerged from the nursery looking frazzled. Mr. Morrison, thank the Lord you're back. I've fed her, changed her, rocked her, nothing works. I'm sorry, but I need to get home to my own family. She grabbed her shawl and hurried out. Barely acknowledging Margaret, Jacob ran a hand through his hair, the gesture speaking volumes about his exhaustion. I'll get her. Let me try, Margaret said quietly. She didn't know what made her volunteer. She'd never cared for a baby in her life, but something about Emma's desperate cries pulled at her heart. Jacob hesitated, then nodded. Second door on the right, Margaret walked down the narrow hallway, her heart pounding. Through the open door, she could see a small crib and a red-faced infant thrashing against her blankets. The baby's dark hair was damp with sweat, her tiny fists punching the air. "Hello, Emma," Margaret said softly, approaching the crib. "You're having quite a day, aren't you?" Emma's crying hitched for a moment at the new voice, her eyes, so like her father's, focusing on Margaret's face. Then she wailed again, even louder. Margaret reached down and lifted the baby, feeling the solid weight of her, the heat radiating from her small body. Emma stiffened in her arms, arching away, but Margaret held her firmly and began to sway, humming a tune her own mother had once sung. I know, she murmured. "Everything's wrong and scary and different. You miss your mama. You don't know who I am. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." She walked to the window, still swaying, still humming. Emma's cries began to taper into hiccuping sobs. Margaret shifted her, supporting the baby's head against her shoulder, and continued the gentle rocking motion. "Your papa loves you so much," Margaret whispered. "And your brothers and sisters. They're all trying so hard. But it's been difficult, hasn't it? Nobody knows quite what to do." Emma's breathing started to even out. Her tiny fingers clutched at Margaret's collar, and gradually, so gradually, the crying stopped. The baby's body relaxed into Margaret's arms, her head heavy against Margaret's shoulder. Margaret stood there, barely daring to breathe, feeling the weight of this tiny life trusting her. Tears pricked her eyes. She'd spent 2 years mourning children she'd never have, but here was a child who needed her right now, in this moment. When she turned around, she found Jacob standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes shone with something that might have been hope or relief, or simply exhaustion pushed to its limit. "How did you—" he started. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. Maybe she just needed someone different. Someone who wasn't already worn out. Charlotte appeared beside her father, her eyes wide. "Emma likes you." She don't never calm down that fast. Over Charlotte's head, Margaret saw the other children gathering in the hallway. William pressing against Rebecca's side, Lucas peering around the doorframe. Samuel leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, but his attention fixed on Margaret and the baby. This was her test, Margaret realized. Emma had been the final barrier. If she couldn't handle the baby, nothing else mattered. "Why don't we get Emma settled for a nap?" Margaret said, "and then maybe someone can show me the kitchen. I could make supper for everyone." "You're staying?" William asked, his voice small and hopeful. Margaret looked at Jacob. A whole conversation passed between them in that glance. "Are you sure? This is your last chance to run. Can you really do this?" "For tonight, at least," Margaret said carefully. Let's take this one day at a time. The tension in Jacob's shoulders eased slightly. Rebecca, show Margaret where everything is. Samuel, go check on the livestock. Lucas, William, Charlotte, pick up the front room. I'll handle the barn chores. The children scattered with the efficiency of kids used to working. Margaret laid Emma gently in her crib, and miraculously, the baby stayed asleep. She followed Rebecca to the kitchen, steeling herself for what she'd find. It was worse than the rest of the house. Every pot was dirty. The stove needed cleaning. The pantry was poorly organized, with supplies running low. But Margaret had worked with less. We got eggs, Rebecca said, opening the cold storage. Some bacon, flour, not much else till Papa can get to town. That'll work, Margaret said, rolling up her sleeves. Can you help me? I'll need water heated and those dishes washed. Rebecca nodded, and they fell into a rhythm. As they worked, the girl began to talk, hesitantly at first, then in a rush, as if she'd been storing up words for months with no one to tell them to. Mama used to make this house sing, Rebecca said, pumping water into a pot. She was always humming or laughing. Even when things were hard, she made it feel okay. Then she got sick with Emma, and everything just stopped. Papa tries, but he's so tired all the time. And I try, but I'm not Mama. I can't be Mama. Margaret's heart ached for this child carrying such an impossible burden. Rebecca, listen to me. You're not supposed to be your mama. You're supposed to be 12 years old. You're supposed to have someone taking care of you, not the other way around. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. But if I don't do it, who will? Maybe me, Margaret said gently. If you'll let me. The girl's face crumpled, and suddenly she was crying, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and painful. Margaret pulled her close, holding her while she shook. I'm so scared all the time, Rebecca whispered. Scared Papa will get sick. Scared something will happen to the babies. Scared I'll mess up and it'll all fall apart. I know, Margaret murmured. I know. They stood there in the messy kitchen while Rebecca cried out months of fear and exhaustion. When the storm finally passed, the girl pulled back, wiping her eyes. I got your dress all wet. Dress is dry, Margaret said. Feelings don't if you keep them bottled up. Rebecca managed a watery smile. Then, squaring her shoulders with determination that made her seem far older than 12, she turned back to the dishes. We should finish. Everyone's hungry. They cooked together. And Margaret found herself actually enjoying it, the simple rhythm of preparing food. Rebecca's running commentary about each sibling's preferences, the warm smell of bacon filling the kitchen. By the time the sun was setting, they had a meal ready. Jacob came in from the barn, covered in dust and hay, his shirt sticking to his back with sweat. He stopped short when he saw the kitchen, dishes washed and stacked, food on the table, Margaret stirring a pot while Charlotte set out plates. You did all this? Rebecca did most of it, Margaret said. I just supervised. The pride that flashed across Rebecca's face was worth more than gold. They gathered around the table, all 7 of them now, with Emma asleep in a basket nearby. It was cramped and chaotic, with William knocking over his milk and Lucas picking at his food silently, but there was something almost normal about it. Samuel was the first to speak what they were all thinking. So are you staying or not? Samuel! Jacob's voice was sharp. That's not how we... It's all right, Margaret interrupted. She looked around the table at each face, hopeful, scared, guarded, desperate. Here's the truth. I came here today not knowing what to expect. I found a family that's hurting and a house that needs work and 6 children who've been through something no child should have to face. The children's faces fell. They'd heard rejection before. They knew what came next. But I also found something else, Margaret continued. I found a father who loves his children enough to admit he needs help. A 12-year-old girl with more courage than most adults I know. A 14-year-old boy protecting his siblings the only way he knows how. And 4 younger children who just need someone to show up and stay. She paused, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. I can't replace your mother. I won't even try. But if you'll have me, I'd like to try being something else. A friend, a helper, maybe eventually family. What does that mean? Charlotte asked. Are you going to live here? Margaret looked at Jacob. They hadn't discussed logistics, timelines, expectations. This was all happening too fast, too soon. The sensible thing would be to slow down, take time to think, make careful plans, but there was nothing sensible about any of this. How about this? Jacob said slowly. Margaret stays for a week. We see how things go. No promises, no pressure. Just see if this might work. And what about my business in Helena? Margaret asked. My room at Mrs. Walsh's? Keep them, Jacob said firmly. You need to know you have somewhere to go back to if this doesn't work out. I won't trap you here. The honesty of it struck Margaret. He was protecting her exit, making sure she knew she wasn't obligated. Most men would have pushed for immediate commitment, for certainty. Jacob was offering her freedom. That's what made her want to stay. A week then, Margaret agreed. We'll see what happens. William suddenly piped up, his voice anxious. But what if we mess up? What if we're too much trouble and you leave like the others? Margaret knelt beside his chair, meeting his worried eyes. William, I'm going to tell you something important. You are not too much. None of you are too much. You're children who've lost your mother, and you're sad and scared and angry, and that's okay. That's normal. If I leave, it won't be because of you. It'll be because I'm not the right fit. But that's not the same as you being too much. Do you understand? William nodded slowly, but she could see he didn't quite believe her yet. That was okay. Trust took time. After dinner, they fell into evening routines. Rebecca showed Margaret where the children's nightclothes were kept. Samuel brought in more firewood without being asked. Lucas actually spoke, just 3 words, thanks for supper, but it was something. Getting 6 children ready for bed was like herding cats, but eventually they were all settled. Margaret found herself in Emma's room for the final check of the night. The baby was awake, gurgling softly, her dark eyes tracking the shadows on the ceiling. Your family's something special, Margaret whispered, picking her up. Broken right now, yes, but special. And if I'm very lucky, maybe you'll let me help put some of those pieces back together. Emma grabbed her finger, holding tight. Jacob appeared in the doorway. You have a gift with her. Or she's just exhausted from crying all day, Margaret said with a slight smile. She laid Emma back down, and the baby's eyes drifted closed. They walked back to the main room, where awkward silence settled between them. Jacob cleared his throat. You can have the spare room. It's not much, but the bed's decent. I'll be in my room if you need anything, and the kids are all down the hall. Jacob, Margaret said, stopping him. Why did you really ask me to come here? Out of all the women in Montana, why someone who can't give you more children? He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. When Sarah was dying, she made me promise something. She said, don't marry someone just to replace me. Marry someone who will love our children for who they are, not for what they can do for you. She knew, even then, that I'd need help. But she wanted the kids to have someone who chose them, not someone who saw them as a means to an end. His voice roughened. You've been rejected for not being able to have children. My kids have been rejected by woman after woman who didn't want to deal with 6 grieving children. Seemed to me you might understand what they're going through, might fight for them the way you had to fight for yourself. Margaret felt tears building again. She was right about you. You are a good man. I'm a desperate man, Jacob corrected. But I'm hoping maybe desperate and good can coexist. That night, Margaret lay in the small spare room, listening to the house settle around her. She could hear Jacob's quiet footsteps as he checked on each child one last time, could hear the creak of old wood and the whisper of wind outside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The children might change their minds. She might discover she'd bitten off more than she could chew. 100 things could go wrong, but tonight, for the first time in 2 years, Margaret Holloway went to sleep feeling like she belonged somewhere, and that was enough. The 3rd day started like the others had. Margaret up before dawn, coffee brewing, attempting to wrangle chaos into something resembling order. She'd fallen into a rhythm. Emma fed and changed breakfast for the older kids. Jacob headed out to work the ranch while she tackled the endless household tasks, but the cracks were beginning to show. Samuel had been testing her since day 1. pushing boundaries like a wolf testing a fence. That morning, he walked straight past his chores, saddled a horse, and rode off toward the hills without a word to anyone. "He does that," Rebecca said quietly when Margaret asked. "It just disappears. Papa used to go after him, but now he's too tired to chase him down every time." Margaret felt frustration building. How was she supposed to help if the children wouldn't let her? Lucas remained a ghost in the house, present but unreachable. When Margaret tried to engage him in conversation, he'd mumble one-word answers and drift away. Charlotte clung so tightly that Margaret couldn't move 3 feet without the little girl attaching herself to her skirts. Terror in her eyes whenever Margaret left her sight. William's bedwetting had gotten worse, not better. Each morning brought soiled sheets and the boys' shame-filled tears. I'm sorry," he'd sob while Margaret cleaned up, and nothing she said seemed to ease his mortification. By noon, Margaret was running on fumes. Emma was teething and inconsolable, screaming for hours, despite every soothing technique Margaret tried. The house seemed to generate mess faster than she could clean it, and the emotional weight of 6 traumatized children was crushing her beneath its enormity. She found herself in the kitchen, Emma wailing in her arms, dirty dishes piled high again, and suddenly couldn't breathe. The walls felt too close, the noise too loud, the responsibility too heavy. "What made you think you could do this?" A cruel voice whispered in her head. "You're not a mother. You're playing pretend, and these children deserve better than your amateur attempts at caring for them." Margaret set Emma in her basket, safely, carefully, and walked outside onto the porch. Her hands were shaking. Her chest felt tight. She sank onto the steps and pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting back tears. She didn't hear Jacob approach until his shadow fell across her. "You all right?" His voice was gentle, concerned. "No," Margaret said honestly. She was too tired to lie. "I'm not. I don't know what I'm doing, Jacob. Samuel won't listen. Lucas won't talk. Charlotte won't let go. William's getting worse, not better. And Emma," her voice broke. "I can't get her to stop crying, and I don't know what's wrong." Jacob sat down beside her, close but not touching. "You've been here 3 days." "Exactly. 3 days, and I'm already failing. Sarah struggled for weeks after each baby," Jacob said quietly. "It took her months to find her footing when we had more than 2. And she grew up with siblings, knew about children. You jumped into the deep end with no preparation," Margaret laughed bitterly. "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "No, it's supposed to make you stop comparing yourself to some impossible standard." Jacob turned to face her. "You got Emma to sleep her first night here." Rebecca actually smiled, for the first time in months. "Charlotte's nightmares have been less frequent. These are small things, but they matter." And Samuel running off. Lucas's silence. "Williams, those problems existed before you got here," Jacob interrupted firmly. "They're not going to disappear in 3 days just because someone new showed up. Grief doesn't work that way. Trauma doesn't work that way." Margaret wiped her eyes angrily. "Then what am I even doing here? If I can't fix things, what's the point?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was raw. "The point is, you showed up. You're still here. Do you know how powerful that is for these kids? Everyone else left. Their mother didn't choose to leave, but she still left. And every woman since has walked away when things got hard. But you're sitting here, frustrated and exhausted and doubting yourself, and you're still here." His words hit something deep inside her. "I don't feel like that's enough." "It's everything," Jacob said. "Margaret, I'm not asking you to fix them. I'm asking you to be present while they heal themselves. There's a difference." From inside, Emma's crying reached a new pitch. Margaret flinched, but Jacob stood and held out his hand. "Come on, let's tackle this together." They went inside, and Jacob took Emma while Margaret prepared a cool cloth. "She might be overheated," he said, loosening the baby's clothes. "Sarah always said babies get fussy when they're too warm." Sure enough, as Emma cooled down, her crying eased. Margaret felt simultaneously relieved and incompetent. Why hadn't she thought of that? "Because you're learning," Jacob said, reading her expression. "That's allowed." That evening, Samuel finally returned as the sun was setting. He walked in filthy and defiant, expecting a fight. Margaret was setting the table and looked up at him calmly. "Wash up." "Supper's ready." Samuel blinked, thrown off by the lack of confrontation. "That's it? No lecture?" "Would a lecture change anything?" Margaret asked. "No." "Then wash up." "Food's getting cold." Something flickered across Samuel's face. Confusion, maybe respect. He disappeared to clean himself off. After the children were in bed, Margaret found herself back on the porch. The Montana sky was spectacular, stars scattered like diamonds across black velvet. Jacob joined her again, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "I talked to Rebecca today," Margaret said, accepting the cup. "Really talked. She told me about her mother, about the life they had before. That must have been hard to hear." "It was beautiful," Margaret corrected. "Sarah sounds like she was an incredible woman. And I realized something. I'm not competing with her memory. I'm just adding a different chapter to this family's story." Jacob smiled slightly. "Took me 6 months to figure that out." They sat in comfortable silence, sipping coffee, watching the night. Finally, Margaret spoke the fear that had been gnawing at her. "What if the week ends and I'm still not sure? What if I can't decide?" "Then we extend it," Jacob said simply. "Margaret, there's no deadline on this. I know I said a week, but that was just to give you an out if you needed it. The truth is, this family needs time. You need time. We all need to figure out if this puzzle fits together, and if it doesn't." Jacob looked at her, his eyes serious in the starlight. "Then we'll deal with that when it comes. But I don't think that's what's happening here. I think you're scared it might actually work, and that's terrifying in a whole different way." He was right, and Margaret knew it. She'd built walls around her heart for 2 years, convinced herself she'd never have a family. Now she was staring at the possibility of exactly that, and it was more frightening than any rejection had ever been. "The children are starting to trust you," Jacob continued. "Rebecca talks about you like you hung the moon. Charlotte hasn't asked for her mother once since you arrived. She asks for you instead. Even Samuel's testing you less. These are good signs, Margaret. But they mean investment. They mean risk. They mean if this doesn't work out, it'll hurt everyone." "No pressure," Margaret said dryly. Jacob laughed, a real laugh, the first she'd heard from him. "Yeah, no pressure at all." Margaret set down her coffee cup and stood. "I should get some sleep. Emma will be up at dawn." "Margaret?" Jacob stood too. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. Not just for the kids, for me too. It's been a long time since I've had someone to share the load with, someone to talk to when the day's done." His words warmed something in her chest. "I'm glad I'm here too. Even when it's hard, maybe especially when it's hard." She went inside, pausing at each child's room to check on them. Samuel sprawled across his bed, one arm hanging off. Rebecca clutched a doll that had clearly been her mother's. Lucas slept curled tight, protecting himself even in dreams. William and Charlotte shared a room, her small form pressed against his for comfort, and Emma, sweet Emma, slept peacefully in her crib. 6 children, 6 different hearts to understand, 6 different ways of grieving, 6 different paths to healing. It should have felt overwhelming. Instead, standing there in the quiet house, Margaret felt something she'd almost forgotten. She felt needed. Not for what her body could or couldn't do, not for some idealized version of womanhood, but for exactly who she was, flawed, learning, trying. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Samuel would probably test her again. Lucas might remain silent. The house would generate its endless chaos. But tonight, Margaret went to bed, knowing she wasn't just surviving this trial week. She was beginning to believe she might actually belong here. And that changed everything. Day 5 dawned with dark clouds gathering over the mountains. Margaret woke to the smell of rain on the wind and a feeling of restlessness she couldn't quite name. The trial week was nearly over, and both she and Jacob had been carefully avoiding any conversation about what came next. She was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Lucas appeared in the doorway. The 10-year-old stood there silently as usual, but something was different. He was holding something behind his back. "Morning, Lucas." Margaret said, keeping her tone light. "Hungry?" He nodded, then slowly brought his hand forward. In it was a crude wooden carving of a bird, rough but recognizable, clearly the work of small hands learning a craft. "Did you make this?" Margaret asked, genuinely impressed. Another nod. Lucas's lips moved, forming words that took effort to push out. "Papa taught me. Before." 3 sentences. It was the most he'd spoken since she'd arrived. Margaret knelt down, holding the bird carefully. "It's beautiful, Lucas. You have a real talent." The boy's face flickered with something, pride mixed with sadness. "Made it. For you. So you. Stay." Margaret's throat tightened. This quiet child who'd barely acknowledged her existence was offering her his art, his heart, his hope. She pulled him into a gentle hug, feeling him stiffen before slowly relaxing against her. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll treasure this." When Lucas pulled back, there were tears on his cheeks, but also the ghost of a smile. He sat at the table, and for the first time, he actually engaged during breakfast, nodding when spoken to, even offering a few whispered words to Charlotte. Jacob noticed immediately. He caught Margaret's eye across the table, and the gratitude in his expression made her heart skip. After breakfast, the storm that had been threatening finally broke. Rain hammered the roof, and wind howled around the house. The children grew restless, cooped up indoors with energy to burn. "Tell us a story," Charlotte begged, climbing into Margaret's lap as she tried to mend a torn shirt. "Yeah, a story," William echoed, pressing close to her other side. Margaret looked. At the expectant faces surrounding her, even Samuel had wandered in, pretending disinterest while clearly listening. She set aside her sewing. "All right. Have I told you about the time my father took me fishing and we caught something unexpected?" "What did you catch?" William asked eagerly. "Well, I was about your age, and we'd been sitting by this creek for hours without a single bite. I was getting frustrated, ready to give up, but my father said, 'Patience, Margaret, the best things come to those who wait.'" She smiled at the memory. 5 minutes later, my line went taut. I pulled and pulled, and when it finally came up, do you know what was on my hook? "A fish," Charlotte guessed. "A boot," Margaret said, and the children giggled. "An old waterlogged boot. I was so disappointed. But my father laughed and said, 'See, I told you the best things come to those who wait. Now you've got a story to tell.'" "That's it?" Samuel said skeptically. "That's the whole story?" Margaret looked at him steadily. "The point is, sometimes what you catch isn't what you expected. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's just different. But there's always something to learn from the waiting." Samuel held her gaze for a moment, something shifting in his expression. Then he stood abruptly. "I'm going to check on the horses." He disappeared into the storm, but Margaret noticed he hadn't slammed the door this time. "He's coming around," Rebecca said quietly. "Slowly, but it's happening." The afternoon dragged as the storm intensified. Margaret worked on organizing the pantry, while Rebecca helped Emma practice sitting up. Charlotte and William played with wooden blocks Jacob had carved years ago. Lucas sat in the corner, whittling a new piece of wood, occasionally glancing up at Margaret as if making sure she was still there. Jacob came in soaked from securing the barn and livestock, water dripping from his hat brim. "Storm's getting worse. We might lose some shingles off the barn roof." "Can you fix it?" Margaret asked. "Not till it passes. Just have to hope the damage isn't too bad." He peeled off his wet coat, and Margaret noticed the exhaustion in every movement. This man carried so much, always trying to hold everything together alone. "Sit," she ordered, pouring him coffee. "You're no good to anyone if you collapse." Jacob sank into a chair gratefully. "Yes, ma'am." Charlotte giggled at hearing her father called ma'am, and the sound broke some of the tension in the room. Evening came early, the sky dark with storm clouds. They ate supper by lamplight, thunder rumbling overhead. Margaret had just started cleaning up when William's scream pierced the air. Everyone rushed to the boy's room. William stood on his bed, pointing at the window where rain was pouring in through a crack in the frame. Water pooled on the floor, soaking the rug. "It's just water, buddy," Jacob said. But William was inconsolable, tears streaming down his face. "It's like the night Mama died," he sobbed. "The storm, the water, everything breaking." Margaret's heart clenched. Sarah had died during a storm. She'd heard that detail from Rebecca. No wonder William was terrified. She moved to the bed, climbing up beside the crying boy. "William, look at me." She took his face in her hands gently. "This is not that night. Your mama's not here, but she's not in danger. The storm is just weather. It's loud and wet and scary, but it's just a storm. But what if something bad happens again? Then we'll handle it," Margaret said firmly. "Together, me, your papa, your brothers and sisters. You're not alone, William. You'll never be alone." Jacob was already moving, grabbing towels to soak up the water. Samuel appeared with boards to temporarily patch the window. Rebecca corralled the younger children out of the way. They worked together, this makeshift family, until the immediate crisis was handled. But William wouldn't let go of Margaret. She carried him to the rocking chair in the main room, holding him close while he shook with leftover fear. Charlotte crawled into her lap too, seeking comfort, and Lucas pressed against her side. Jacob watched from the doorway, something unreadable in his expression. "Sing something," Charlotte whispered. "Mama used to sing when we were scared." Margaret's voice was rough, unpracticed, but she began the lullaby her own mother had sung. Slowly, the children's breathing evened out. Charlotte fell asleep first. Then William's grip loosened as he drifted off. Even Lucas's eyes grew heavy. "I should get them to bed," Margaret whispered to Jacob. But Rebecca was there, taking Charlotte gently. Samuel, surprising everyone, picked up William. "I got him," he muttered, carrying his brother down the hall. Lucas stood on his own, rubbing his eyes. He looked at Margaret. "Stay," he said simply, then shuffled to his room. Margaret stood, her arms empty but her heart full. She found Jacob still watching her. "What?" she asked. "You're good at this," he said quietly. "Better than you think. I'm just doing what feels right. That's what makes you good at it." Jacob stepped closer. "Margaret, the week's almost up. We should probably talk about—" "Not tonight," Margaret said quickly. Fear curled in her chest. "Let's just get through the storm first." Jacob nodded, understanding, and they settled into the quiet routine of ending the day. But as Margaret lay in bed that night, listening to the rain pound the roof and the wind rattle the windows, she couldn't avoid the truth anymore. She didn't want to leave. Somewhere in 5 chaotic days, this broken family had become hers. These children with their grief and their hope, this exhausted man trying to hold it all together, this messy house full of love buried under loss. It had all become home. But wanting something and being brave enough to claim it were two different things. The storm raged through the night. Margaret drifted in and out of sleep, hearing footsteps in the hall as Jacob checked on the children, the creak of floorboards, the constant drum of rain. Sometime near dawn, a different sound woke her, crying but not from a child. She slipped out of bed and followed the sound to the kitchen. Jacob sat at the table, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. On the table in front of him was a photograph of Sarah, beautiful and smiling, so full of life. Margaret froze. This felt private, sacred. She should leave, let him grieve alone. But something made her step forward instead. "Jacob," she said softly. He looked up quickly, wiping his eyes, embarrassed to be caught. "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. Don't apologize." Margaret sat across from him, looking at Sarah's photograph. She was lovely. "She was everything," Jacob said, his voice breaking, "and I keep trying to move forward, to do what she'd want. But some nights it just hits me all over again. She's gone. She's really gone. And I'm here trying to replace her with—" He stopped abruptly, horrified. God, Margaret, I didn't mean—" "It's okay," Margaret said, though the words stung. "You're not replacing her. You're trying to survive. There's a difference." Jacob shook his head. "You don't understand. I invited you here, let the kids get attached, and I don't even know if I'm capable of moving on, of being what you might need if you stay." The vulnerability in his confession broke something open in Margaret. She reached across the table, taking his hand. He tensed, then gripped her fingers like a lifeline. "Jacob, listen to me. I'm not asking you to stop loving Sarah. I'm not asking you to pretend she never existed or that she wasn't the love of your life." Margaret's voice was steady, sure. "I'm just asking you to make room. Room for something different. Not better, not worse, just different. What if I can't? Then we'll figure that out together." Margaret squeezed his hand. "But you don't have to decide right now, in the middle of the night while a storm's raging. You don't have to have all the answers." Jacob's laugh was watery. "You sound like you're talking yourself into something." "Maybe I am," Margaret admitted. "Maybe we both are." They sat there in the pre-dawn darkness, hands clasped across the table, the photograph of Sarah between them. It should have felt wrong, but it didn't. It felt like permission. Sarah's, theirs, the universe's. "The week's up tomorrow," Jacob said finally. "I know. What do you want to do?" Margaret looked at this broken, beautiful man, thought of 6 children sleeping down the hall who needed her, remembered Lucas's carved bird, and William's frightened tears, and Rebecca's smile, and even Samuel's grudging respect. "I want to stay," she whispered. "I'm terrified, and I don't know if I can do this, but I want to try, not for a week, not for a month. I want to try for real." Jacob's eyes filled with fresh tears, but this time they looked like relief. "You're sure?" "No," Margaret said honestly, "but I'm sure enough." The storm began to break as dawn crept through the windows. Jacob stood, still holding Margaret's hand, and pulled her gently to her feet. "Then stay," he said. "Please stay." And Margaret, who'd spent 2 years believing she'd never have a family, who'd been rejected and broken and convinced she wasn't enough, stepped forward into the terrifying, beautiful unknown. "I will," she said. "I'll stay." Outside, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and pink. A new day was beginning, and for the Morrison family, a new chapter was about to start. Margaret returned to Helena the next morning, but only to settle her affairs. Mrs. Walsh wept when Margaret told her the news, though they were tears of joy. "I knew it," the old woman said, gripping Margaret's hands. "I knew when you left last week that you'd found where you belonged. I could see it in your eyes, that spark of hope I thought had died." Margaret packed her belongings, not much after years of living simply, her sewing supplies, her clothes, and a few precious photographs of her parents. She sold her business to another seamstress in town, a young widow who needed the income. The transaction was bittersweet, but Margaret felt no regret. She was closing one chapter to begin another. The gossip mill of Helena churned furiously. Women whispered in the mercantile about the Barren seamstress who'd somehow caught herself a widower with 6 children. Some were genuinely happy for her. Others sniffed that she was simply desperate enough to accept what no sensible woman would want. Margaret didn't care. Let them talk. She'd spent too many years caring what people thought, measuring herself by their narrow definitions of worth. Pastor Coleman sought her out before she left. "Margaret, I want you to know how proud I am of you. You're walking towards something beautiful, even though it terrifies you. That's real courage." "Or real foolishness," Margaret said with a nervous laugh. "Often the same thing," the pastor replied, smiling. "I'll be praying for you and your new family." Your new family. The word settled over her like a blessing. 3 days later, Margaret stepped off the stage in Boulder for the second time. But everything felt different now. This wasn't a trial or a test. This was coming home. Jacob was waiting with the wagon, and this time all 6 children were with him. Charlotte saw her first and screamed with joy, launching herself from the wagon before it had fully stopped. Margaret caught her laughing as the little girl wrapped around her like a vine. "You came back! You really came back!" Charlotte cried. "Of course I did," Margaret said, smoothing the child's blonde curls. "I promised, didn't I?" William approached, more cautiously, as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too fast. "You're staying forever now, not just visiting." Margaret knelt down, looking him in the eyes. "Forever, or at least as long as you'll have me." William threw his arms around her neck, and Margaret held him close, feeling his small body shake with relief. Rebecca helped load Margaret's trunk onto the wagon, her eyes bright. "I cleaned out Mama's sewing room for you. Thought you might want a space for your work." The gesture touched Margaret deeply. Rebecca was making room for her, literally and figuratively. "Thank you, Rebecca. That means more than you know." Even Samuel had softened. He didn't say much, but he took Margaret's heaviest bag without being asked and secured it in the wagon with care. Lucas pressed something into her hand. Another carved bird, this one more detailed than the first. "Welcome home," he whispered. Jacob helped Margaret onto the wagon seat, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," Margaret confirmed. The ride to the ranch felt different this time. Charlotte chattered excitedly about all the things they'd do now that Margaret was staying. William pointed out landmarks as if she were a newcomer to the territory. Rebecca sat close, occasionally reaching over to squeeze Margaret's arm as if to confirm she was real. When the ranch came into view, Margaret saw it with new eyes. Yes, it needed work. The fences still sagged, the barn roof still leaked, the house still showed signs of neglect. But she also saw potential. She saw home. That first week of permanence brought its own adjustments. Margaret converted Sarah's sewing room into her workspace, carefully packing away the previous occupants' belongings with Rebecca's help. Each item told a story: a half-finished quilt, a collection of buttons, a journal filled with recipes and household notes. "Mama would want you to use this space," Rebecca said, running her fingers over the sewing table. "She'd want someone to fill it with life again." They hung Margaret's dresses in the closet, arranged her sewing supplies on the shelves, and placed Lucas's carved birds on the windowsill. The room transformed into something that honored the past while embracing the future. The children's healing continued in fits and starts. Some days were better than others. Charlotte's nightmares decreased but didn't disappear entirely. William still had accidents, though less frequently. Lucas spoke more, but remained a quiet soul by nature. Samuel's walls came down slowly, brick by brick, day by day. But there were victories too. Rebecca laughed more easily, the weight of responsibility lifting as Margaret shouldered her share. Emma started calling Margaret Mama in her baby babble, which made Margaret cry the first time it happened. The house gradually transformed from a place of survival into a place of living. 2 months after Margaret's permanent arrival, Pastor Hutchins visited the ranch. He found a scene that warmed his heart: Margaret in the kitchen with Rebecca, teaching her how to make bread. Charlotte and William playing in the yard under Lucas's watchful eye. Samuel working alongside his father to mend a fence, actually talking and laughing. Emma crawling across the floor, exploring her world with fearless curiosity. "Jacob," the pastor said as they sat on the porch, "when I sent that letter to Helena, I prayed I was doing the right thing. Now I see that prayer was answered beyond what I could have imagined." Jacob watched Margaret through the window, flour dusting her cheeks as she laughed at something Rebecca said. "She saved us, Pastor. This family was drowning, and she threw us a lifeline." "I think you saved each other," Pastor Hutchins observed. "She needed a family as much as you needed her. That evening, after the children were in bed, Jacob found Margaret on the porch, their usual meeting spot for end-of-day conversations. The Montana sky was ablaze with stars, the air crisp with approaching autumn. "Margaret, I've been thinking," Jacob began, his voice unusually nervous. "We've been living in this, in-between space. You're here, your family, but we haven't really defined what that means, what we are to each other." Margaret's heart quickened. They'd been dancing around this conversation for weeks, both afraid to name the feelings growing between them. "What do you want us to be?" she asked quietly. Jacob turned to face her fully. "I want you to be my wife. Not just a caretaker for my children or a helper around the ranch. I want you to be my partner, my companion, my love." Margaret's breath caught. "Jacob, Wait, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I know I said I'd always love Sarah, and that's still true. But I've learned something these past months. The heart has an infinite capacity for love. Loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for her. It's just different, like you said that night during the storm. Different, not better or worse." He took her hands, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "You came into our lives when we were broken, and you didn't try to fix us. You just loved us, messy, damaged, difficult as we were. You saw worth where others saw burden. You gave everything expecting nothing in return." "That's not entirely true," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I expected to feel like I belonged somewhere, and I do. I finally do." "Then marry me," Jacob said. "Not out of convenience or necessity, but because we choose each other. Because we've built something real here, something worth claiming." Margaret looked at this man who'd given her everything she'd been told she couldn't have: a family, a home, a purpose. Who'd seen her not as incomplete, but as exactly what was needed. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Jacob pulled her close, and Margaret rested her head against his chest, feeling his heart beat strong and steady. They stood there under the vast Montana sky, two broken people who'd somehow made each other whole. They married 4 weeks later in the small church in Boulder. The ceremony was simple, attended by the few families who'd supported them through the hard times. But the children made it extraordinary. Rebecca had sewn Margaret a new dress, cream-colored calico with delicate embroidery at the collar. Charlotte wove wildflowers into Margaret's hair. Lucas carved a special gift, 2 birds intertwined, representing their joined families. Samuel stood up as Jacob's best man, his posture proud, his eyes suspiciously bright. William and Charlotte scattered flower petals down the aisle. Emma, now over a year old, sat in Rebecca's lap and clapped her chubby hands when Jacob and Margaret exchanged vows. "I, Jacob Morrison, take you, Margaret Holloway, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Jacob said, his voice strong and sure. "I promise to honor you, cherish you, and build a life with you that honors both where we've been and where we're going." Margaret's voice trembled but held firm. "I, Margaret Holloway, take you, Jacob Morrison, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you and your children, to help carry the burdens and multiply the joys, and to choose this family every day for the rest of my life." When Pastor Hutchins pronounced them husband and wife, the children erupted in cheers. Charlotte shouted, "Now you're really our mama!" And the entire congregation laughed through their tears. The reception was held at the ranch, with neighbors bringing food and the community gathering to celebrate. Margaret stood in the yard, watching Jacob swing Charlotte around, while Samuel taught William how to rope a fence post. Rebecca showed off baby Emma to admiring church ladies, and Lucas sat quietly whittling another bird, a small smile on his face. Mrs. Walsh had made the journey from Helena and found Margaret in the midst of it all. "Look at you," the old woman said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You found your family after all." "They found me," Margaret corrected. "I was the answer to their prayer, but they were the answer to mine, too." That night, after the guests had left and the children were finally asleep, Jacob and Margaret stood together in their home, truly theirs now, bound by law and love. The house was quiet, cleaned up from the celebration, filled with the peaceful breathing of sleeping children. "I have something for you," Jacob said, pulling a small package from his pocket. It belonged to my mother. Sarah wore it too, but she'd want you to have it now. He opened the box to reveal a simple gold locket. Inside were two tiny photographs. On one side, a picture of Sarah with the children. On the other, a space left empty. I thought maybe we could put a picture of you there, Jacob explained. So both of you are carried together. The past and the present, the love that was and the love that is. Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. This man understood what so many didn't, that honoring what came before didn't mean erasing it, that she could be a mother to these children without pretending their first mother never existed. It's perfect, she whispered as he clasped it around her neck. The months that followed brought their own challenges, of course. Marriage wasn't a magic solution, and the children still had hard days. Samuel still struggled with anger sometimes. Charlotte still had occasional nightmares. William's confidence was fragile. Lucas's silence sometimes returned. Rebecca still took on too much responsibility. Emma, growing into a toddler, had the Morrisons' stubbornness in full force, but they faced it together now. Margaret and Jacob, partners in every sense. When one faltered, the other stood strong. When both were overwhelmed, they leaned on each other until they found their footing again. The ranch slowly transformed. Fences were mended, the barn roof repaired, the house painted and maintained. Margaret's sewing business found new life as she took on special orders from women across the territory, her reputation for fine work spreading. Jacob's cattle operation stabilized, with Margaret's help managing the books and planning. But more than the physical improvements, the family itself transformed. Laughter returned to the Morrison house. Hope replaced despair. The children learned that loss didn't have to be the end of the story, that new chapters could be written, new love could grow, and healing was possible. 1 year after Margaret's arrival, she sat on the porch with Emma on her lap, watching the other children play in the yard. Jacob joined her, settling into his usual spot beside her. "You know what tomorrow is?" he asked. "How could I forget? It's the anniversary of the day I got off that stage, terrified I was making the biggest mistake of my life." Jacob smiled. "Best mistake either of us ever made." Margaret watched Samuel teaching William how to ride, Rebecca braiding Charlotte's hair, Lucas showing them his latest carving. "You know what the cruelest irony is? I spent years being told I couldn't have a family because I couldn't bear children. Now I have 6 children, and I didn't give birth to a single one. But they're mine in every way that matters." "They are," Jacob agreed. "And you're theirs. Not because of biology, but because you chose them. You choose them every day." Emma grabbed Margaret's face, planting a wet, sloppy kiss on her cheek. "Mama," she said, clearly giggling. The sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was approaching the ranch, a woman Margaret recognized from Helena. It was one of the church ladies who'd been among the gossips, one who'd whispered about Margaret's desperate situation. The woman dismounted, and Margaret steeled herself for judgment. But instead, the woman's eyes were filled with something else entirely, hope mixed with desperation. "Mrs. Morrison," the woman began, her voice trembling. "I apologize for arriving unannounced. My name is Eleanor Price. We've met before in Helena, though I doubt you'd remember me kindly." Margaret's spine stiffened, but she kept her voice level. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Price?" Eleanor's composure cracked. "My sister, she's recently widowed, left with 4 children and a small farm she can't manage alone. She's drowning, Mrs. Morrison, just like I imagined Mr. Morrison was before you came." Tears welled in her eyes. "I was one of those women who whispered about you, who said terrible things about your situation. But watching you now, seeing what you've built here, I was wrong. So very wrong." Jacob stood, his hand finding Margaret's shoulder in support. "What exactly are you asking, Mrs. Price?" "I'm asking if Mrs. Morrison might know of another woman like herself. Someone the world has overlooked, someone with a good heart who might be willing to take a chance on a ready-made family." Eleanor's voice broke. "My sister doesn't need someone who can give her more children. She needs someone who can love the ones she already has." Margaret felt the weight of the request. This woman who'd once judged her was now seeking her help, recognizing that what society deemed a flaw had actually been a blessing. "Give me a few days," Margaret said quietly. I'll write to some people I know. There are women out there, good women, who've been passed over for the same reasons I was. Maybe one of them is your sister's answer. Eleanor's face flooded with relief. Thank you. Thank you so much. After Eleanor left, Jacob pulled Margaret close. You're going to help her find someone, aren't you? Even after how she treated you, especially because of how she treated me, Margaret replied. If my story can help another woman find her place, another family find healing, then maybe all those rejections meant something. Maybe they led me here, not just for my own sake, but so I could be a bridge for others. Over the following weeks, Margaret became exactly that. She corresponded with Pastor Coleman in Helena, with other clergy across Montana, with women she'd met during her years of rejection. She connected Eleanor's sister with a woman named Virginia, a former teacher who'd been deemed too old for marriage at 35, and who'd spent a decade watching other people's children while longing for her own. 3 months later, Margaret received a letter from Virginia, now settled with her new family. You gave me hope when I had none left, Virginia wrote. You showed me that the path to family doesn't always look like we expect it to. Thank you for seeing me as someone worthy of this chance. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she read the words. Jacob found her in her sewing room, the letter clutched in her hands. Another success? He asked, already knowing the answer from her expression. The 4th one, Margaret said in wonder. 4 families were brought together because someone decided that being unable to bear children didn't make a woman less valuable. 4 women who were told they weren't enough are now exactly what someone needed. Jacob kissed the top of her head. You started something important, Margaret. You're changing how people think about family, about worth, about what makes a person valuable. That evening, at supper, Rebecca brought up something that had been on her mind. Mama Margaret, she said. The children had naturally started calling her that, differentiating her from their first mother, while still claiming her as their own. My friend Sarah Jenkins at school. She asked me something today. She wanted to know if you're really our mama, since you didn't birth us. The table went quiet. This was a question the children had probably all wondered, but never voiced. Margaret set down her fork, looking at each child in turn. What did you tell her, Rebecca? I told her that being a mama isn't about where babies come from. It's about who takes care of you when you're sick, who teaches you things, who holds you when you're scared, and who stays even when things get hard. Rebecca's voice grew stronger. I told her you're more my mama than some women who give birth to children and then leave them. You chose us. That makes you our mama in every way that counts. Samuel nodded firmly. Anyone who says something different can answer me. William climbed into Margaret's lap, something he still did when he needed reassurance. You're my mama, he said simply. The only one I really remember. Lucas, now more comfortable speaking, added his voice. Mama Sarah gave us life. You gave us living again. Both are mama things. Charlotte, ever practical, declared, You're Mama Margaret, and that's that. And if Sarah Jenkins has a problem with it, she can take it up with my fist. Charlotte. Margaret tried to sound stern, but couldn't quite manage it through her tears. We don't solve problems with our fists. Fine. Then she can take it up with Samuel's fist. His is bigger. The whole table erupted in laughter, the kind that came from deep joy and complete belonging. Later, as winter settled over Montana, the Morrison Ranch thrived in ways that went beyond simple survival. Jacob's cattle operation expanded. Margaret's sewing business brought in steady income. The children excelled in their various ways. Rebecca showing talent for teaching and helping at the town school. Samuel becoming skilled with horses. Lucas's woodcarving earning commissions from neighbors. Charlotte's fierce spirit making her a natural leader among the younger children. William's gentle nature perfect for caring for animals, and Emma growing into a bright, curious toddler who had the entire family wrapped around her tiny finger. But perhaps the most remarkable change was how the Morrison family became a beacon for others. Families struggling with loss or hardship found their way to the ranch, knowing they'd find understanding and practical help. Margaret and Jacob never turned anyone away. They shared what they had, offered what wisdom they'd gained, and reminded people that brokenness wasn't the end of the story. 2 years after their marriage, Margaret discovered something unexpected. Dr. Patterson, who'd come to check on Emma's persistent cough, asked to speak with Margaret privately. "Mrs. Morrison, I know what Dr. Bennett told you years ago in Helena about your ability to have children," he began carefully. "But medical science isn't infallible. What seemed certain then, well, based on some symptoms you've mentioned, I think you might be with child." Margaret's world tilted. "That's impossible. Dr. Bennett said doctors can be wrong. The scarring he saw might have healed over time. Bodies change. Miracles happen." Dr. Patterson smiled gently. "I can't be completely certain without more time passing, but the signs are there." Margaret sat in stunned silence, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach. After everything, after building a family through different means, after accepting her inability to bear children as part of her story, now this. She told Jacob that night, her voice shaking with uncertainty. "I don't know how I feel about this. Part of me is overjoyed, but part of me is terrified. What if the children think I wanted this all along? That they were just substitutes until I could have my own?" Jacob pulled her close. "Our children are smarter than that. They know they're loved. A new baby wouldn't change that. It would just expand it. But what if something goes wrong? What if, then we'll face it together," Jacob said firmly. "Just like we face everything else." Margaret wasn't showing yet when they gathered the children to tell them. Rebecca figured it out immediately from Margaret's nervous expression. "You're going to have a baby," Rebecca said, her eyes wide. Margaret nodded, holding her breath for their reactions. Samuel spoke first, surprising everyone. "Does this mean we're not enough? That you needed one that's really yours?" Margaret's heart broke at the fear in his voice. She moved to him quickly, taking his face in her hands. "Samuel Morrison, you listen to me. Every single one of you is really mine. Biology doesn't make you more or less my child. This baby, if it comes, and Dr. Patterson says it might not, that we shouldn't count on anything, this baby would be your sibling, part of our family. Not a replacement, not more important. Just another piece of this beautiful, complicated puzzle we've built together. But everyone always said you couldn't have kids," William said, confused. "That's why those men didn't want you. Doctors thought I couldn't. They were wrong. Or maybe my body healed. We don't fully understand it." Margaret looked at each child. "But here's what I know for certain. Even if I'd known this was possible back then, I would still choose you. I would still choose this family. Because you six are the greatest gift I've ever received." Charlotte, ever direct, asked, "So we're getting another sibling? Like Emma but smaller?" Despite the tension, Margaret laughed. "Yes, something like that." Lucas, thoughtful as always, said quietly, "Mama Sarah would like this. A new baby for our family. She'd say it's a blessing." That perspective shifted something in the room. Rebecca nodded slowly. "Lucas is right. Mama always wanted a big family. She'd be happy we're growing." The children's acceptance, once given, was absolute. They began planning for the new baby with the same enthusiasm they brought to everything else. Rebecca started sewing tiny clothes. Samuel built a new cradle with Jacob's help. Charlotte declared herself the baby's future protector. William worried about being a good big brother. Lucas carved a mobile of birds to hang above the cradle. Even Emma seemed to sense something was coming, patting Margaret's stomach and babbling happily. But Margaret's pregnancy wasn't easy. At 30 years old, carrying her first child after years of believing it impossible, her body struggled. Dr. Patterson monitored her closely, prescribing bed rest for the final months. The children rallied around her with fierce protectiveness. Rebecca took over the household management with competence that made Margaret proud. Jacob barely left her side when he wasn't working. In the 8th month, complications arose. Margaret's blood pressure spiked dangerously. Dr. Patterson was frank about the risks. "Mrs. Morrison, this could go badly. For you, for the baby, or both. I need you to understand what we might be facing." Margaret, holding Jacob's hand, was calm. "I've lived more in the last 3 years than in all the years before. I've known love, family, purpose. Whatever happens, I'm grateful for what I've had." "Don't talk like that," Jacob said roughly. "You're going to be fine. You and the baby both. The children were terrified. They'd already lost one mother. The thought of losing another was unbearable. They prayed together every night, their young voices begging God to spare the woman who'd saved them all. And then, on a crisp March morning in 1892, Margaret went into labor. It was long and difficult. Dr. Patterson worked tirelessly while Jacob paced outside with the children, their faces drawn with fear. Rebecca held Emma, who cried for her mama. Samuel's jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful. Lucas whittled nervously, his hands needing something to do. Charlotte and William clung to each other, both fighting tears. Hours passed. Then, just as the sun was setting, a baby's cry pierced the air. Dr. Patterson emerged, exhausted but smiling. "You have a son. And Margaret, she's weak, but she's going to make it." The collective relief was palpable. Jacob rushed inside to find Margaret pale and exhausted but alive, holding a tiny bundle with dark hair and Jacob's eyes. "Meet your brother," Margaret said softly as the children filed in quietly. "We're naming him Daniel. It means God is my judge, because only God could have made this miracle possible. 7 children now. 7 lives woven together by choice, circumstance, and love, stronger than any biology could create." As Margaret recovered over the following weeks, she watched her family expand to embrace this new member. The children were gentle with baby Daniel, protective and loving. But she noticed something beautiful. Their love for him didn't diminish their bond with her or each other. If anything, it strengthened it. They were family. Not despite their differences, but because of them. Margaret's heart swelled impossibly full. This life, chaotic, messy, beautiful, was more than she'd ever dreamed possible. She'd walked through rejection and heartbreak to find something she never knew she was looking for. "You're the answer to prayer," Jacob had said in that first letter. And he was right, though not in the way either of them had expected. Margaret had been the answer to this family's prayer for help, for healing, for hope. But they'd been her answer too. Proof that worth wasn't measured in what you could produce, but in who you chose to be. In how you loved, in the lives you touched. The Montana sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The children's laughter carried on the wind, all 7 of them now, playing together in the yard. Jacob's hand found Margaret's, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. 3 years passed, and the Morrison Ranch became something of a legend in its own right. Travelers passing through Boulder would often hear stories about the remarkable family on the hill, the woman who'd been rejected for her barrenness, who now had 7 children, the widower who'd chosen love over convention, and the children who'd learned that family was built on far more than blood. Daniel grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's determination and his mother's gentle heart. But what struck visitors most was how seamlessly he fit into the tapestry of his siblings. There was no distinction made between the 6 who'd come before and the one who'd come after. They were simply the Morrison children, bound by something far stronger than mere genetics. One crisp autumn afternoon, a fancy carriage rolled up to the ranch. Out stepped a well-dressed gentleman from back east, a journalist named Henry Whitmore, who'd heard whispers of the Morrison story and wanted to document it for his newspaper. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, removing his hat respectfully, "I've traveled from Boston to hear your story. They say you've revolutionized how people think about family out here in Montana Territory." Margaret, bouncing Daniel on her hip while supervising Charlotte and Emma's bread-making lesson, laughed at the grandiose description. "I haven't revolutionized anything, Mr. Whitmore. I just lived my life and loved my family. But that's precisely what's revolutionary," Whitmore insisted. "May I speak with you?" "With your husband?" "With the children?" Jacob emerged from the barn, wiping sweat from his brow. After a brief discussion, they agreed to let Whitmore stay for dinner and observe their family. What he witnessed transformed his understanding of what family could mean. He watched Rebecca, now 16, teaching at the town school 3 days a week while managing household responsibilities with grace. He saw Samuel, 18 and every bit a man, working the ranch alongside his father with quiet competence. He observed Lucas, 13, selling his intricate carvings at the general store to contribute to the family income. He noticed how Charlotte, 12, had become Emma's fiercest protector while maintaining her own spirited independence. He saw William, 10, gentle with the animals and patient with young Daniel in ways that showed true maturity. But what struck Whitmore most was the dinner conversation. These children spoke with intelligence and thoughtfulness, supporting each other's dreams while maintaining their individual identities. When he asked them about their mother, expecting awkwardness about Margaret's role, Samuel answered plainly. "We had 2 mothers," he said, looking Whitmore straight in the eye. "Mama Sarah gave us life and loved us first. Mama Margaret saved us and loves us still. We're lucky enough to have been blessed twice." Rebecca added, "People get confused about love, thinking there's only so much to go around. But love multiplies. It doesn't divide. Every person added to this family just makes more love, not less," Whitmore scribbled furiously in his notebook. Knowing this story would resonate far beyond Montana, his article, published 3 months later, created ripples across the nation. The Morrison Miracle, How One Woman's Flaw Became a Family's Salvation, told their story with such heart that letters began arriving at the ranch from all corners of the country. Women wrote sharing their own stories of rejection, of being deemed insufficient because they couldn't bear children. Widowers with children reached out, asking if Margaret knew other women like herself who might be willing to build unconventional families. Orphanages sent inquiries, wondering if this model of family building could help place older children who were typically passed over for adoption. Margaret and Jacob's small dining table became command central for an unexpected mission. They corresponded with families, connected lonely women with grieving widowers, offered advice to those building blended families, and reminded everyone who wrote that there was no single path to creating a home filled with love. "We've become accidental matchmakers," Jacob said one evening, watching Margaret respond to yet another letter by lamplight. "More like hope dealers," Margaret corrected, signing her name with a flourish. "We're dealing in hope for people who thought they'd run out." But their most significant impact came from an unexpected source. A territorial judge named Augustus Palmer arrived at the ranch one spring morning with a proposition that would change countless lives. "Mrs. Morrison." "Mr. Morrison," Judge Palmer began as they sat in the parlor, "I've read about your family, and I've been giving considerable thought to our territory's orphan situation. We have dozens of children in institutions, particularly older children and sibling groups, that nobody wants to take. But your family has proven that blood relation isn't necessary for strong family bonds." Jacob leaned forward, intrigued. "What exactly are you proposing, Judge?" "I want to change our adoption laws," Palmer said firmly. "Currently, adoptive parents must prove they're taking children for altruistic purposes, and there are severe restrictions on who can adopt. But I believe we need to recognize that families like yours, built on choice and commitment rather than biology, are just as valid and perhaps even more stable than some traditional families." Margaret's heart raced. "You want to make it easier for people to adopt older children?" "Sibling groups?" "Precisely. And I want to use your family as the model case. With your permission, I'd like to present your story to the territorial legislature. Show them that a woman who cannot bear children can still be an exemplary mother. That a widower with 6 children isn't a poor prospect, but rather a man with much love to give. That children from different circumstances can bond as siblings just as deeply as blood relatives." The implications were staggering. Jacob and Margaret exchanged glances, an entire conversation happening in that look. "We'll do it," Margaret said. "If our story can help those children find families, then everything we've been through, every rejection, every hardship, it all means something bigger than just us." The months that followed were intense. Margaret testified before the territorial legislature, standing before stern-faced lawmakers and sharing her story with unflinching honesty. She spoke of rejection and pain, of finding purpose in unexpected places, of learning that worth wasn't determined by biology, but by the content of one's character. Gentlemen, she concluded, her voice strong and clear, I stand before you as living proof that what society deems a flaw can become someone's greatest asset. I couldn't bear children, so 12 men rejected me. But because of that flaw, I was available when 6 children desperately needed a mother. Now I have 7 children, and not one of them loves me less because we don't share blood. If we can remove the barriers preventing other women like me, other men like my husband, from opening their homes to children who need them, we won't just be changing laws. We'll be changing lives. The legislature passed the Morrison Act in the fall of 1895, making Montana Territory the most progressive region in the nation for adoption rights. The law specifically allowed single women, widowers with existing children, and couples unable to have biological children to adopt with fewer restrictions than before. It recognized that financial stability and character mattered more than marital status or reproductive capacity. Within a year, 17 children from the territorial orphanage found permanent homes. Within 3 years, that number grew to over 60. Other territories began examining Montana's model, and slowly, the conversation around adoption and family began to shift across the nation. But perhaps the most profound change happened right in Boulder. The town that had once whispered about the Barren seamstress and the desperate widower now looked to the Morrison family as an example of resilience and love. Young couples facing infertility found hope in Margaret's story. Widowers and widows with children no longer felt their circumstances made them undesirable. Children in difficult situations learned that family could be chosen, not just inherited. On Margaret's 35th birthday, the town threw a celebration at the church. It wasn't just for her birthday, it was gratitude for how her presence had transformed their community's understanding of family and worth. Pastor Hutchins stood at the pulpit, his voice thick with emotion. 5 years ago, I took a chance and sent a letter to Helena, connecting 2 broken people who needed each other. I thought I was helping one family. I had no idea we were starting a movement that would touch hundreds of lives across this territory and beyond. He gestured to Margaret, standing with Jacob and their 7 children. Margaret Morrison taught us that rejection isn't the end of the story. It's often the beginning. She showed us that what we perceive as limitations can actually be preparations for something greater. And she reminded us all that the measure of a person isn't found in what they can produce, but in how they love. The crowd erupted in applause. Margaret, overwhelmed, buried her face in Jacob's shoulder as their children gathered around them. Rebecca held Emma's hand. Samuel stood tall with Daniel on his shoulders. Lucas, Charlotte, and William pressed close, their family unit tight and unbreakable. That night, as the celebration wound down and they headed home under the vast Montana sky, Samuel spoke up from the back of the wagon. Mama Margaret, do you ever think about those 12 men who rejected you? Margaret considered the question carefully. Sometimes, but not with anger anymore. I used to wonder what was wrong with me that they couldn't see my worth. Now I realize they did me the greatest favor of my life. How's that? William asked, curious. Because every rejection led me closer to where I was meant to be. If any of those men had said yes, I wouldn't have been here when your father needed me. I wouldn't have you 7 as my children. I wouldn't have discovered my true purpose. She smiled in the darkness. Sometimes what feels like the worst thing that could happen is actually the universe clearing the path to the best thing that could happen. Rebecca, wise beyond her years, added, it's like Papa always says, God doesn't waste pain. He transforms it into purpose. As they approached the ranch, lights glowing warm in the windows, Jacob pulled Margaret close. Any regrets? He whispered. Margaret looked at their home, filled with children they'd built a family with through choice and commitment and love that defied convention. She thought about the women who'd found hope through their story, the children who'd found families because of the Morrison Act, the community that had learned to value people differently. Not a single one, she whispered back. This life, every beautiful, chaotic, impossible moment of it, is more than I ever dreamed possible. Years later, when historians would write about the evolution of family law in the American West, they would point to the Morrison Act as a turning point. Legal scholars would study how one family's story changed the conversation around adoption, worth, and what constitutes a family. But for Margaret Holloway Morrison, the woman 12 men rejected, the legacy wasn't in laws or headlines or history. Books, it was in 7 children who called her mama. It was in a husband who saw her as whole when the world called her broken. It was in countless women who found courage in her story to believe they were enough. It was in the knowledge that rejection had led her to her destiny, that pain had birthed purpose, and that the very thing meant to limit her had actually set her free. She was home. She was loved. She was exactly enough. And that, she knew, as she tucked Daniel into bed while her other 6 children's laughter echoed through the house, was the greatest miracle of all. Sometimes the world tells us we're broken, but the right people see us as whole. And sometimes what we think is our greatest weakness becomes our most powerful gift. Margaret Holloway's journey from rejection to redemption reminds us that our worth isn't determined by others' acceptance or by society's narrow definitions of value. She was rejected by 12 suitors who saw only what she lacked. But Jacob Morrison and his 6 children saw what she possessed: love, strength, dedication, and a heart vast enough to hold a fractured family until healing came. Her story became a catalyst for change, transforming not just one family, but an entire territory's understanding of what family could mean. In the end, what the world called a devastating flaw became her greatest gift, and what seemed like a bitter ending became the most beautiful beginning. Her legacy lives on in every unconventional family that dares to love beyond biology, every person who refuses to let rejection define them, and every soul who discovers that broken pieces, when fitted together with love, create something more beautiful than perfection ever could. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.